Hello and welcome to the third episode of this six-part mini-series assessing the growing impact of industrial life cycle assessments on the shipping and transport industries. I'm Craig Eason, a journalist, editor, writer and owner of the Fathom World site and also host of the Aronnax podcast.
And I'm Rasmus Elsborg Jensen. I'm the CEO and founder of Reflow. At Reflow, we make it easy to become data-driven and basically understand everything in regards to climate on products and complex assets like ships.
And now in this series, I'm interviewing industry experts from analysts to bankers, cosmetics manufacturers to PhD researchers to understand how life cycles are entwined and connected. And I'm using my guru Rasmus here as my guide and yours to unravel this story to see what the future holds.
Thanks, Greg. I'm looking so much forward to this episode as we will talk to Øystein Jensen from the shipowner Odfjell. Øystein is actually one of the very first, to my knowledge at least, chief sustainability officers that we have seen being announced from a shipowner perspective. And here we will hear a little bit about the complex task of balancing all the sustainability efforts a ship owner really can do in a very competitive landscape. So really exciting.
But this is good because, as you know, in our earlier episodes, we heard from the cosmetics company, we heard from a maritime equipment supplier and a sustainable finance expert. So in this perspective, it's really good to be able to get the ship owner and operator perspective and bring that in because ships, well, I used to work on them. They're very large, complex machines. By far, I'd say the biggest mobile man-made thing on our planet. Some of them are giants. The huge engines, they use huge amounts of fuel which is created, like most fuel in society, from crude oil and natural gas. And shipping is a huge industry too. There's hundreds of thousands of ships of varying sizes, built for various purposes and to sail at various optimal speeds. And that's a key part of this discussion.
That's true, Craig. In the last episodes, we talked to different suppliers and producers. And I think what we're going to hear today from the ship owner's perspective is naturally, as you mentioned, the fuel. The fuel is very important in regards to the emissions as a ship owner, because the fuel, I've seen some studies that are, depending on the design and the operational profile of a vessel, is nearing almost 90% of the life cycle emissions of the fuel when it's using traditional fossil fuels. So this is really one of the first steps that the ship owner will need to look at. And then the next big thing is then saying, okay, now you as a ship owner start to decarbonize your fuel. What then? Where does the emissions go? And this is where life cycle assessment comes in, because life cycle assessment, that's also what we're doing at Reflow, is helping these ship owners to understand the emissions, building these life cycle assessment models of their ships, or we call them digital climate twins. So basically a digital model that allows the ship owners to get a more granular understanding of the emissions of the vessel, not just the fuel, but everything else on the vessel. And so that could work as like a baseline. So when the ship owners start looking at changing parameters like the fuel, they will have a better understanding of what is happening to the emissions of the vessel. It could be that they introduce new technology. So that's super exciting and very interesting when ship owners start being LCA driven or more climate driven, looking at that data. Now, the big obstacle when we talk about life cycle assessment and as a ship owner is data. And I think there's traditionally been no need for ship owners to keep a structured way of organizing their data of the different life cycle stages of their vessels. So this is really something that also Øystein from Odfjell, starting to work with life cycle assessment, will see as an immediate obstacle. But once they start getting the data, and this data could be information from when the ship was built in Korea and what engines have been chosen and how they're maintaining the vessel. Once they start collecting this data and organizing it, it can be introduced into these digital climate twins, and then they will be able to make a lot of modeling.
Well, let's hear what Øystein has to say, because let's not forget that Odfjell, as a parcel tanker company, they've got lots of different cargoes on their vessels. It may look like it's a tanker carrying liquid products, chemical tanker, but of course, being parcels, lots of different cargo owners. So I wanted to start the discussion by asking him about that perspective on sustainability and how he sees that voyage where he's got so many different cargo owners looking at what that particular ship is doing.
As you say, one of our vessels, they can have up to, let's say, 50 different customers at the same time. We go on a route, right? So it's almost like I tend to compare it to a bus where you always want to fill up the passengers all the time. You're never really empty. When we see that bulk owners or container owners, they are quite clear on their expectancy towards transportation. We do not see that the same with our customers within chemicals. So I remember half a year ago I said that will take about 9 months, and I think I will stick to that almost promise. Because we see that there's a lot of attention on reporting now, but we do not see any kind of movements where the logistic departments of the major chemical companies that they want to award or are thinking that it will be a benefit for them to use a transporter with the lower emissions. We see that there's, when you're looking at some of these companies, they have stated clear targets on scope 3 emissions, and that means that we have started also having that educational journey with our contacts within these companies and saying that we are contributing to your scope 3. So it will be beneficial for you to use a transporter with lower emissions because that contributes to your scope 3. But at the moment, it's still only down to the price, but I think that will change basically due to the inclusion of shipping into the emission trading scheme. That's one thing, and the other where you will have the implementation of the EEXI and CII, where the ships actually will be rated. So I think that there will be customers that will have to be looking at the rating of the vessels that they are using in their supply chain.
Is there any sort of correlation that you can make at the moment in terms of how you look at the choice of fuel, whether it's ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, methane, or LNG or whatever they call it, or biofuels? How do you look at all of those fuels and look at how you put them into a life cycle assessment of a vessel or the vessel's voyage?
Yeah, very good points. We are, of course, monitoring that as everyone else. We see that there's a lot of points, and if you read in TradeWinds or other news sites, you see that there constantly someone new that have an idea on what's going to be the future fuel. We are focusing on what we are able to control. So I think that the discussion of tank to wake versus well to wake is an important discussion, because we are not in a position where we can control the infrastructure or the access. We just need the access to the fuel, and when we got that fuel on board, we will make sure that fuel from a tank to wake perspective is zero. So this is more like a question of when you're going zero, right? And of course we are doing whatever we can in order to improve efficiency and improve on intensity. But we're looking at the zero target. We are thinking this from a tank to wake perspective. But we cannot kind of lose sight of the full life cycle perspective either, because as an example, if you're looking at some biofuels today, they have much higher total life cycle emission than traditional fuel that we're using today. But we try to focus on what we can control, and we can control the technology that we have on board, and we also need access to zero fuel that are that is zero from a tank to wake perspective, and so that is kind of going into the same picture.
Have you started to look, even I dare say, to how the ships are built? How you construct a vessel, how you design, build, run, operate, and dismantle a vessel?
Yeah.
Have you looked at that?
We have at least started. I think that the challenge there is where do you actually start and where do you actually end? I think that is a challenge, and especially if you think of the scope 3 element, and I think that's why there's been kind of a delay in reporting of scope 3, because it's not 100% clear what should be covered. So what we have done is that we have initiated a project where we are looking at our vendors, our major vendors, and we're saying that, okay, let's so the equipment that we buy, let's say we buy pumps, and we want our vendors to provide the CO2 footprint of these products. And of course, there are a lot of vendors that is not capable of reporting that, and we don't have that data, but we have started a process. So I hope that we will come in a position where we have sufficient amount of vendors that can report on this, and we can use kind of a modeling to give a proxy understanding of the vendor side. And then, of course, you have the shipbuilding side, where for the next time we will build a vessel, I'm quite sure that we want to make sure that we are able to report on the CO2 footprint of actually the production of that vessel. And then you have the tail end, right? And the footprint of the actual recycling. But then again, the steel from a recycling, that will also reduce the amount of CO2 compared to from basic steel production. So it's much more environmentally friendly to use a recycled steel than to use that from iron ore, right? So we have not done a full project on this yet. We have started working with our suppliers. We want to think what's our position in the total life cycle, and I think that this will be an area there where we see more and more attention from stakeholders. We are again having a holistic perspective, but we are thinking of what are we able to control, and so what we do is that we want to make sure that we do our business with as less footprint as possible, but then you come into situations where there are no choices, right? So you need to buy these things, but we also want to send a signal to our vendors that this is something that is important for us. And let's say, given everything else equal, we will of course in a while select those with less footprint as well, because well, you see the new proposals from the SEC on climate reporting, where companies under the SEC has to report on scope 3 or what's material to them. So I think that this will just increase going forward, and it comes to a point where we need to report much more on scope 3 and scope 3 relevance, or in a kind of a life cycle, taking a life cycle perspective, and also report on it much more than we are doing today.
That was Øystein Jensen from Odfjell Tankers there, Rasmus. Have you seen many other shipping companies begin to take their life cycle assessments this seriously?
I think as we also hear from Øystein, the ship owners have traditionally been very compliance focused, because it can cost money to go above and beyond on the climate effort. So traditionally we have seen a lot of ship owners being driven by the minimum compliance. But we are now actually starting to see ship owners, and we are already working with a handful of them, that are incorporating life cycle thinking and LCA models into their work. And this is really interesting, because these ship owners have understood that it really is a game about making the best investments. And when you have a model like an LCA model of the vessel, you will actually know where you'll have the highest emissions. Also, if you introduce different types of fuels, and then you will be able to work much more data-driven and, as you could say, get more bang from the buck, because the investments will then go directly where you have the emissions, instead of shooting in the blind, as we have heard other companies have been doing. You really don't know where you'll have your emissions. So that's really a good thing about the ship owners, is starting to work with life cycle thinking. And what is also interesting is we're seeing that some of these ship owners are actually starting to engage with their suppliers and their manufacturers to set different goals. And I will see, well, what we can see is this trend when a ship owner is engaging with the suppliers and help them to set goals of the emissions of the products that they buy. This will actually also benefit the supplier market, because we will start to see that the environmentally conscious suppliers and the suppliers of higher quality products will be rewarded in this game, because when they produce higher quality products, it might cost more in the beginning, but since they will last longer, they will have to buy few rounds of equipment to compensate. So that really means that the emissions over time will be less, thus having less emissions produced in land, because this is really where the big emissions of the equipment that we see is being produced. So here we are starting to also see the effects on land.
That strikes me, though, that in the end, what you're going to have is a lot of different information sources that you're going to have to bring in to get your true picture, because it could be, like Øystein saying, getting the picture for pumps. It could be the life-saving equipment. There's lots of different pieces of equipment that go onto ships. These are extremely complex machines.
That's true, Craig. When we do these life cycle assessment models of ships, our engineers are many times doing over 300 to 400 different life cycle assessment models of each product category. So it is really complex. And that's also why the more a ship owner have made of these, the more data they will build up over time. So they don't need to get primary data from each supplier every time, because they will know when I buy a motor or an engine of this size, it will represent this amount of carbon emission equivalent. So they will start to gain the knowledge, and they don't need to engage with all the suppliers every time. But I think it is really also a game of saying, okay, now we got the data, let's beat our baseline. And I think this is where it gets really interesting. That is for the ship owner to get a baseline of where is our vessel emissions, and then engage with the high emitters, the suppliers of products that have high emissions on the vessel, and then beat the baseline, because then you will start to get to somewhere really exciting a lot faster. So this is really what we're seeing a little trend of today. But I agree, there is a lot of data, and that is why you will need digital systems like we have here at Reflow, and other suppliers are starting to introduce to manage this life cycle data. And here you also have an economy of scale, because the more suppliers you have connected to your system, the easier it will be for the ship owners to get the data much faster.
Now, I want to return back to Øystein from Odfjell now, because there's another pressure that I wanted to get his perspective on. When I asked him, he reminded me that Odfjell is a listed company on the Oslo Exchange, and as such, it has institutional investors that are already putting questions to him about the company's footprint.
At the moment, there are no Scope 3 reporting requirements, but we see that a lot of companies. We met with an investor that reports on their Scope 3, and they wanted to have a dialogue with us because we were one of their major contributors to their Scope 3. So that means that what they told us is that it would be easier for them to sort of divest from us, but they thought it was better to having that dialogue with us to make sure that they are following that transition. So I think that you will see more and more kind of mature or conscious investors that taking that perspective, but that's not under the existing regulation yet. Then you have the EU taxonomy, and where you need to sort of meet a set of different criterias in order to be aligned with the ambitions, and then the following regulations under the kind of EU Fit for 55 package. So what we have done is that we have actually reported on the EU taxonomy and our activities to meet these two of the major objectives. That's that where the screening criteria is ready. At the moment, we don't see a major drive from banks or others to make sure that we are aligned with the EU taxonomy. I think that there are numbers around that about 5% of the total activities investment universe is taxonomy aligned at the moment. So we are not taxonomy aligned. We have that's how we have stated it, and we don't see that is an issue. What we have done is that we have seen an opportunity of sort of connecting the commitments of our climate ambitions to our financing. So what we did almost 2 years ago now is that we made a sustainable financing framework, and underneath that framework we have issued the first sustainability linked bond in our industry, and we have also done loans under there. So I think that will be something that's will be more interesting and more in driving businesses going forward, because it's an opportunity for companies. Because what we saw is that was substantially oversubscribed, and we got a lot of positive attention on doing that. But from the regulatory side, we don't see that attention to the EU taxonomy. We expect to see that there will be a kind of a massive attention to it when we got the emission trading scheme in the EU going into force.
Øystein Jensen from Odfjell. Now, there are some shipping companies with the resources and capabilities to move the needle. And I'm finding it interesting that Øystein again points to the pressures that he thinks will be increasing through the EU, the taxonomy, for example, the reporting directive and the ETS.
Yeah, the maritime industry is something of its own here. And what we hear from Øystein is actually there is a little focus only from the investor sides on the EU taxonomy. That falls in line with what we hear from our side, is that the investors are not looking that much attention to the taxonomy at the moment. They're looking at the ESG ratings more and more, but the taxonomy is somehow a little bit on the side. And I think the reason why we are seeing that is, in my opinion at least, is the EU taxonomy in certain areas is a little bit outdated. It has focused on what's called tailpipe emissions or direct emissions. So it really focuses on the emissions coming out of the engine instead of looking at, in this case, the whole ship. And that is really a shame, because as many ship owners are starting to decarbonize their vessels, they're introducing a lot of new technologies. This could be investing in hybrid propulsion with batteries and other technologies. And these technologies might not emit emissions directly into the air, but we do know that batteries, they leave a substantial carbon footprint somewhere on the planet from its rare earth minerals and all the processes it takes to work with these minerals. So we do know that emissions are being emitted, but since the taxonomy is not addressing those, it is hard for also the ship owners and the equipment manufacturers to really follow along here. Because if you look at the EU taxonomy, as I've read it, when you have a vessel where you are introducing batteries, for example, well, the taxonomy would categorize this as a zero emission vessel. And that's, in my opinion, a problem. And that's also why we're seeing countries like Denmark and other EU countries are launching initiatives right now to introduce life cycle thinking as a way to bring, you could say, the whole emission game up in the perspective. Because if we run around calling all our solutions zero emission because we're introducing batteries or fuel cells, or we're introducing new types of fuels, well, then we're going to have a problem pretty quick, because we are moving the emissions away from the sea into land, and we start using rare earth minerals. We start using resources and moving our planetary boundaries somewhere faster than if we start incorporating this life cycle thinking and really seeing if we are doing any burden shifting. And that's what it's called when you move the emissions from one area to another. That is burden shifting. And if you start doing that, it is very important that you incorporate methods like life cycle assessment to assess it. So you know before you make the investment, is this also good for the planet, or is it just a good investment? And that is really what the EU taxonomy is all about. But the way I see it is not really up to date. And that's also why we are seeing organizations like Sea Europe is really moving and pushing EU to start incorporating life cycle thinking into their assessment of the EU taxonomy. So that's interesting to see what that lands.
Now, as we heard from Øystein, and as we've seen from the work at the IMO, there's now discussions about the life cycle assessment story in shipping from a fuel perspective. This has begun, but the focus is squarely on fuels, as you said here, Rasmus. It's very much a case of, do we want to focus on the fuel, or do we want to focus on the whole ship to get the whole perspective of the ship? Because there's so many other things going. In future episodes, we're actually going to touch on that, touch on the on that aspect that you were talking about. But it is, unfortunately, I think, getting political. Shipping is under pressure to decarbonize. And just as a reminder, the IMO, or rather the United Nations member states that attend the IMO committee meetings, have agreed to a decarbonisation trajectory for shipping. There's pressure for this to be sped up, and effectively means finding new fuels for vessels, current and future vessels. And this is where the discussions are getting very detailed. There are fuels such as hydrogen and ammonia, which, when used as a fuel on a ship, will emit no CO2 emissions. And then there's fuels like synthetic natural gas, methanol, which do. However, the latter fuels will use, or can use, captured CO2 when they're made. So it is a very complex picture. Additionally, ammonia made today comes from hydrocarbons, as does methanol and LNG. So this transition needs a definite picture of the fuel life cycle. So this discussion is now at the IMO, and it will likely be up for increased discussion in December, when the IMO's Marine Environmental Protection Committee, MEPC, meets again. So clearly, we now need to talk about life cycle assessment of marine fuels here, Rasmus. So I met with two people recently that helped me understand a little bit about this. One is Anne O'Connor, who has a dedicated role at the Maersk McKinney Møller Centre for Zero Carbon Shipping. And the other one is Megan Rue. She's a PhD researcher at the Technical University of Denmark. Here's Anne O'Connor on her definition of LCAs for marine fuels.
Basically, an LCA analysis is extremely comprehensive. It looks at a wide range of environmental impacts. It looks at the energy required by the system to produce the fuel, to transport the fuel to the user to actually combust and use the fuel on board the vessel. And so it looks at the energy required by that system, plus the material use. And it looks at the climate impacts of those two main inputs. And then it expresses the output as a whole range of different environmental impacts.
So Rasmus, from what I heard here, the ship owners are still unclear of what they are going to need to do. The fuel choices are there, a handful of key ones really, but the regulators have not finished writing the rules or guidance that the ship owners need, particularly when it comes to a fuel LCA. So what's your take on this at the moment? How hard is it going to be to do an LCA of a marine fuel, given how many factors will go into how the fuel can or will be made?
Yeah, I think Craig, what we hear here from Anne O'Connor is really a shame that it takes so long time to put a standard in place on how to assess these fuels, because if the industry have that in place, it will be easier for them to measure apples and apples. But that's not going on at the moment. So it's really difficult for the many ship owners to know where to make their investments. We have ship owners like Maersk that are investing heavily into methanol, but that is just one out of many ship owners. And I think one of the big interesting factors is when we're introducing a new fuel, that is that we're basically creating a whole new supply chain that will also make emissions in the whole new creation. And I think to go all the way back, when you do an LCA, you go all the way back to the feedstock. That means what goes into making the fuel. And the problem here is if you're starting to look at a biofuel, as we also heard a little bit about, so a biofuel is based on a biomass. And many producers are looking to introduce or to use waste elements into this biomass. And that could be different shells that are not being used, or it could be some waste product from making coffee or something like that. But the problem is that when you start engaging a new feedstock, you will also start making it perhaps a primary element. And that means that when you're looking at the maritime industry, I read somewhere that every year it requires 75 million tons of fuel. So this is really a lot of fuel that the industry is in need of. And if you start basing it on certain fuels or feedstock, you can risk that you are changing the whole supply chain of this feedstock, or this that used to be waste. Suddenly you can end up having manufacturers that are exclusively producing coffee just to have the waste product. And then they're starting to change behavior. And that is some consequences that we are not aware of. And that is why you will need LCA to also look at the consequences of choosing new feedstock, new fuels. And that is really important. Another thing is also that many of these processes will require energy to be added to the processes when you create these new fuels. And that is something that traditionally on fossil fuels we have not looked at. But when you are designing new fuels, it's really important that you end up not introducing more energy than you actually are saving by creating this fuel. So it's important that you balance out all these processes so the energy consumption or the emissions being produced to produce this energy is less than the alternatives out there. And that's also where green energy is super important and very important. So there is a big demand of fuel out there from the maritime industry, and it is one of the first areas that they will need to look at. But we also know it requires a lot of fuel. And now I said 75 million tons of fuel per year. Now we are seeing some of the newer fuels have a less energy intensity. So I've seen some examples. You will require triple the volume of fuel to compensate for the very energy dense fossil fuel that we have that we're using today. So this really underlines the need for LCA and also underlines the need for legislators to agree on how do we assess the fuel very, very fast, because we can risk having ship owners or producers invested in technologies that can actually do more harm than good. And we will not know because we will not have enough high decision grade data to make the decision on. It's something that is really central, and that's also why it's so important that Maersk McKinney Center is focusing on this area, that we will need to have these standards in place. We will need to have, if at least there is no standard from the legislation side, then there could be some industry standards that will be introduced. And I think that might be what's going to happen in the future.
Thanks, Rasmus. So in our next episode, we're going to go a bit deeper into this with Anne O'Connor and Megan Rue on just how a life cycle assessment process is evolving for marine fuels and how LCAs and the well-to-wake analysis of a fuel are not the same thing. Thank you for listening to this episode, brought to you by Fathom World in partnership with Reflow, a life cycle assessment expert in Copenhagen, Denmark. I'm Craig Eason, editor and owner of the Fathom World website, host of the Aranex podcast. You can sign up for the regular Fathom World newsletter, as well as follow this podcast on Spotify and most podcast apps.
And I'm Rasmus from Reflow, and you can follow Reflow and Fathom World on LinkedIn and Twitter. And of course, you can stay in touch with all the magic that's happening. And until next episode, goodbye.
Goodbye.